Hello, and again, welcome to the Pcea Evangelism Summit. And thank you for being part of the sessions that have been so impacting. And on this session, we're going to be looking at the role of the church in politics, especially in this turbulent season. And we are so delighted to have with us Dr. Abraham Rugo. Dr. Abraham Rugo has been on many fronts a leader in the church. He still is. And also has an active interest in politics. But also importantly, he is an expert in the area of devolution, which is definitely a big thing for us in this country. And also he is involved in policy. And also, and very importantly, also he is what was the last thing?
Yeah, and of course, engaged a lot in public finance.
We have to retake that. What the civil society part? I just want to. Yeah. In live shows, I would have had a way of going around it, but you know, you can retake. Hello and welcome again to this session of the Pcea Evangelism Summit. And thanks for being part of the sessions that have been going on. Lots of perspectives that are helpful to us, especially in bringing evangelism to life at this in this particular time. And on this session, we're going to be looking at the role of the church. Especially in this turbulent season, specifically in the political aspect. And that's something that is of interest to all of us because we actually are already in the election year. And we are happy to be engaging in this session Dr. Abraham Rugo, who has been and is a leader in the church for the longest of time. And also in terms of politics, he has been actively involved in politics in different ways. Also, he is, in terms of his daily work, an expert in governance and public finance, things that are very close to the issues in our republic. And he also saw a top leader in the civil society, and no better person can explain to us and engage us in this area of the church's involvement in the political space, especially in this time. Dr. Abraham?
Thank you very much, Furi. It's always a pleasure to participate, particularly because I believe that my faith in God is a key driver as to why, because he's a God who calls for justice. He's a God who desires fairness. It's a God who desires that we live a dignified life now and even into eternity. So dignity should not just come into eternity. It should also be enjoyed right here.
Okay. You know, when you mentioned the word dignity, and that's a heavy word because one wishes that was a focus of the institutions that run this country to make sure that the citizen lives a life of dignity in every way. But sometimes it looks like that's not exactly the focus.
I mean, which is a pity because when you read our constitution, we promise ourselves and provide for ourselves in the Bill of Rights that every Kenyan, every citizen of the Republic of Kenya, to whom sovereign power belongs, has a right to a dignified life. Whether you talk about the kind of socio-economic kind of opportunities and entitlements and engagements they should have, kind of political space, freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom. So in other words, what we are saying is that it's not that we are not clear of what we should be doing, is that there's a disconnect somewhere, and this disconnect has to largely be, to do with how seriously, how fiduciously we are basically implementing what we have committed to ourselves. So it's really a pity because it is not lack of clarity. It lies somewhere else, because institutions is what we establish for ourselves to be able to provide and ensure that the balance between rights and responsibilities is achieved, because each of us has certain rights, but we also have certain responsibilities, and that is how dignity is achieved.
Speaking from a governance point of view, makes me also think from a biblical point of view, where Jesus expressly says that he came that we might have life
and have
life
it in
in
abundance.
fullness. Right in that space, if you were to expound dignity from the biblical perspective, you'd find it locked there. And
please note that verse in John 10:10. It basically starts with the antithesis of it, that is, the thief comes to steal three things: kill and destroy. And that tells you that when institutions get corrupted, get warped, then they steal the potential of its people, the dignity of its people. They kill it and destroy it. But Jesus says that I have come that you may have life and life in abundance. In other words, Jesus is coming with a redemptive, a restorative, and we'll talk about that, when we are thinking about the role of Christ, and therefore the extended role of Christians and the churches, as a collective of them. That restorative, that we started with dignity, but somewhere along the way we lost it.
When you say lost it, and you again take us just the prior piece of that scripture, kill, steal, and destroy, versus or compared to life in fullness. If we think in terms of agency and reflect about our country, then you can tell what we have more. The agents we have more. Precisely. Because what's going on here
it's
is
more stealing, killing, and destroying.
And that's a very big point, because when Jesus came, he came to save people from their sins. And we're going to be looking also at how that connects also with sinful systems.
Yes.
Now, the task of the church, pointing the world to this Messiah who comes to save, is really what is tied up a lot with evangelism.
Correct.
And but of course, when you hear evangelism, many things come to mind.
Yes.
I especially remember at a college level, like keep your evangelistic team, another team like Pcea evangelistic team, and Kuala evangelistic. There were all these things going on, and putting it right now where we are at. When you hear evangelism, Dr. Rugo, what comes to your mind?
Well, when I hear the word evangelism, I hear lostness. There is still a sense in which we attach evangelism to lostness, and lostness seems also to be attached to marginalization and disadvantagedness, if there's a word like that, of a people. And therefore, a lot of people take evangelism to be that thing that you go out of your normal space of operation, take some leave and go to some dry parts of the country, carry some food, and go meet people who are not literate, for instance, or are not fairly exposed to, and share, or even in the city, in the more, unreached or disadvantaged areas. But when you think about what God, what Christ's commission, he says that go ye and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There Jesus is saying that I am sending you to make disciples. In other words, all of you who have come to me, I'm also sending you back to your world. Now, which is your world? Your world is where you spend your life. For me, that is evangelism, and that's how I interpret it. So that evangelism is what I do with my energy, with my time in my workplace. It's how I live, it's my lived reality of Christ where I am. Because the only people, the people who spend time around me, I might be the only way they will ever get to know about, this redeeming Christ, this loving Christ, And therefore, evangelism therefore ceases to be getting and going out to almost an inward focus. And that's why even in the areas that Jesus talked about, he said, first focus on Jerusalem, where you are. And then he goes and expands the areas, by the time he's getting to Samaria and to the ends of the earth, he's simply saying, before you go out there, come in here. And in here is different places. It's a border for the guy who runs a border. It's the taxi for the guy who runs a taxi. It's a clinic for that doctor or nurse that runs there. It's a classroom for the teacher. It's the congregation for you, like being a pastor of a parish. But more importantly, is that it is where we spend our time. It's in where we take our children to school and for different. And how we embody Christ, because we've all heard that our actions and our lifestyle speak so loud that people can barely hear what we are talking and what we are saying.
Yeah, and one reality is that, again, when you hear evangelism, it is associated with some names.
Yes.
And so many names come to mind locally, continentally, and also globally. For instance, people like Billy Graham, who spend their lives really as evangelists.
Correct.
But that generation of evangelists and their kind of evangelism, seems to have died with them. And nothing seems to have, in a way, lived up or emerged, so to speak, to continue with that type of evangelism. I don't know what your take is on that.
I think you're right. My belief and reading of Scripture is that the evangelistic responsibility or calling has largely three aspects. There's a proclamative, or proclaiming the loving grace of God. And proclaiming is what you do, is what the evangelists that you talk about, where people come in large numbers and they get proclaimed to through music and through expounding of the word of God. That's what we know Billy Graham for. But there's a second aspect of evangelism, which is what I call the prophetic, which has to do with speaking hope, and calling things as though they were. And therefore, when you think even about the church as an that has an evangelistic role, there's that prophetic voice of speaking beyond just the things that they are dealing with, but even within their communities and their society. But there's a last part that is extremely important, and that is the restorative aspect. Now, the restorative aspect is what will cause us to go beyond just proclaiming, because for a hungry people, good news is food. And we see Jesus getting to a point where he proclaims, he prophesies and speaks and says, this is not all. This is why I came, that you may have life and all those things. But he also does address the needs, and that's the restorative part of the evangelism. I feel, and my sense is that we still have not run out of the proclamative. It's just that the form has changed. Not to blame COVID or praise COVID. Now we cannot have the mass meetings as they were. But remember, even without the mass meetings, now we have a lot of media to reach the same people in spaces that initially could not be reached. Because remember, for the kind of meetings you're saying, somebody had to take an effort to go to that meeting. But now we have it on TV, we have it on radio, we have it on social media, right on people's phones. So I feel the form has changed, but the greater need has also gone to the restorative part of it. Both restoring people from their sinfulness, to leave certain habits and addictions of form, but also restoring people's dignity so that the hungry are fed. This is a restorative aspect of it.
I think the word dignity has reappeared.
Yes.
And of course, when we talk about personal salvation, there is a level of what we can say dignity, spiritual dignity that is restored to a person. And so there's a big emphasis when you think about evangelism to the salvation of the individual person.
You're right.
But these persons also, they are saved from their sins. But when they go back to their homes, they are dealing on a day-to-day basis with what we can describe as sinful systems.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And now I want you to maybe tell us just the nature, of the sinful systems, especially coming from the contemporary world we're living in.
Correct. You see, Furi, we all live in a place, or at least have a place where we lay our heads. It may not be very comfortable that we will desire, and therefore there's an aspiration of growth. But the realities of our day-to-day life are whether I have food on my table for my children, is whether I have school fees for my children and I'm able to, whether I have clothes. More importantly, is whether the road outside my door has potholes or is functional. Whether the dispensary at the corner of our location or sub-location is open, is functional, is open on time, has a nurse who comes and knows what she's doing or he is doing, and has the necessary supplies, or essential supplies, as we call it. Is when I go to a government office where I need to renew my ID, whether the person there is able to serve me and serve me on time, and he or she is actually present in that process. Is that the taxes that are collected from me are actually spent for purposes of addressing. Those are the realities. But what we interact with, when systems are broken, we interact with abuse. And abuse not just of the systems out there, so that then if I get into a matatu, I'm not too sure how much I will end up paying, whether I'll be taken to the place where I need to, to be taken, whether I will arrive with all my property that I am carrying because I might find a thief in there. If I go to a police station, will my case be handled with the privacy it deserves and with the speed it requires? And that is the lived reality. That when we interact with those systems, many of us, when we see a police person, man or woman, we shudder, even when we are not on the wrong. When you see them lifting up their hand, you start worrying, what is it that I am? It's a sign that the system is broken. And what that does is that because the dignity of you as a person, your personal peace and security is so compromised by and perturbed by such a system, you are not at peace. You are not at rest. So you are stressed, not because you have not eaten, maybe even you have not eaten, and I know there are many people who sometimes don't have that food, but you are stressed because you don't know what you will interact with next, in terms of that brokenness. And therefore, we cannot leave the salvation of the individual to just this aspirational expectation of the coming heaven. I believe God, the God who says, I honor, those who measure correctly. Even when you go to buy meat nowadays, you have meat from 10 bob up to how much. You want to make sure that the 10 bob you're paying for actually is for the right amount. The scales are correct. And therefore, salvation is too special, so powerful to be left just for the rescuing of the soul as though from a fire.
It's larger than that.
It's larger.
It's about fullness of life.
Oh, yes.
Now let's stay with that
Yeah.
because when you talk about embodying Christ in the community, we talk about systems
Yes.
that are broken.
Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind is that there are some communities, let me say, that are so politically aware as individuals. Let me give an example, like the African American community. Talk about justice.
They are aware.
And the individuals, not just the institute, not just, let's say, the church, for instance. The individuals are so aware that if you say a word that demeans them, or you say a phrase that demeans them, or an act that demeans them, they act up immediately on the spot.
Yeah.
But on a day-to-day basis, there is a dimension of our church. I mean, the church in Kenya, and in several other places, where the political awareness of the individual Christian is either recessive or absent. Can you speak to this area?
Yeah, I think, allow me to start from the point that politics, there is political activities and there is political behavior. The political activities have to do with how power is obtained and used for decision making on a day. It's about who gets what, when, and how. And therefore, it does not matter what your perspective of politics is. It affects you. I just gave a couple of examples before. Whether the road that you use is carpeted or not is a political decision. Because certain resources have to be allocated. And in Kenya especially, that process is a political process. Whether there will be more allocation for nurses and doctors, especially during this time of COVID, or vaccines, is a political decision. But there is political behavior. And the political behavior in Kenya, for instance, has been largely associated with goonism, with recklessness, with abuse of office, with rigging, with all the bad terminology. And therefore, it is easy for a believer to say, I don't want to be associated with this dirt, with this mess. After all, Jesus said, keep yourself holy. Do not be like them. Keep your robe white, for those only shall be, shall see the kingdom. Stay pure. So, but as much as you want to disassociate yourself with the undesirable behavior, you cannot disassociate yourself with the outcomes of the political activity. And that is why whether the MCA of your ward has an idea of what he's doing or has no idea of what he's doing, at the end of the day, he holds the decision as to whether resources will be allocated to your ward or not. And therefore, but come to the church, but because of that desire to stay pure and to stay away not to be contaminated, you find that the church has taken a very passive position. I call it a passive position. Of course, we have a couple of leaders who have risen and raised concerns, about how things are. But it's because they have an appreciation of the implication of any decision, that needs to be done. But I think it needs to go beyond just decisions that are of a moral question. Whether you think about the bigger questions around, is this a secular nation or is it a religious nation? The respect or lack of respect of persons of different, identities, and all those things. But going to the reality of that a person not being able to access healthcare is an equally immoral issue.
Yeah.
As these are the things we consider the big sins.
Which is very important here, because let's stay for now with that individual Christian.
Yeah.
And there's a certain, we can say, and we must, give it a name, is that somehow the church has propagated political illiteracy when it comes to the individuals. But you talked about political behavior.
Yeah.
What does political behavior in from the Christian point of view, in circumstances like the ones you're talking about maybe health, about roads, about education, about injustices and oppressions and extractions in these spaces, how does individual Christian political behavior look like?
So, you see, the individual Christian in that context is one of separation, is one of do no harm, see no evil, and do no evil.
That is how it is as prominently. But how should it be? Yeah.
But how should it be? Good question. It should be that because I believe in God, I am disturbed by what disturbs God. You know? And Micah would say, for he has shown you, O man, and what does he desire? To walk humbly with your God, to show mercy and do justice. In other words, that I cannot be at peace when my brother or my sister, regardless of whether he shares my faith or not, is being treated unjustly. I should not be pleased that I am driving, but others are walking in potholes. Our behavior must be one that reflects that we are disturbed by what disturbs God.
You know, when you say that, we do see people, even at local levels.
Yeah.
For instance, if you find a particular place has a lot of, it's lost in, bad brew that is killing people.
Yeah.
And, or sometimes there's insecurity.
Correct.
You do see people speak up, even when the authorities are there.
Yeah.
They're speaking out. But sometimes we make that a preserve of the bold.
Correct.
But what you're saying is that there should be a God drive.
There should be a God drive, what we call the holy anger. You know, it can make sometimes cause you to to create a lot of maybe more havoc than necessary. You saw what Moses did. Moses is born a Jew, but is raised an Egyptian. But deep in his heart, he knows, don't belong to the palace. I belong to my people out there. So the day he sees an injustice being done in the palace, he decides to act. Of course, his holy anger drives him to do what he does to that guy. He kills him. And then he runs away. But he runs away thinking he's going to save his life. But basically he runs into God's hands where he gets prepared to come and now do the work of redemption. Do the work of getting the people back and fulfilling the promises of God. But let me come to the question you have asked. I think a lot of the reason why we see more passive behavior than active behavior is a conflict of identity. And tied with identity is value. You know? Now, the identity that we have, the unique identity in God, is almost what you would call a pure identity. But what happens? That sin corrupts that identity. And therefore we start looking for other identities. And one of the common ways of looking for other identities, and this is what we see with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Jesus' time, is that we try to now use God and godliness, and Paul does talk about it when he talks about some think that godliness is a means to financial gain, to amass power and wealth. So that then we can find an identity that can match this corrupt behavior that we see. And therefore we try to make the church as powerful as possible financially and build massive structures and you might know the history of the massive structures, so that then we can match the powers. But it's a question of where do we find our identity? Because once our identity is in God, we see the people, his people, for what they are. We see the indignity for what it is. But we also know that very well, that whereas we can fight the injustice, we can disagree with the indignity of God's people, we still must love God's people, even the ones causing the injustice. In other words, while God abhors the injustice, he still has a loving grace and attention to the one causing the injustice.
Of course, there's an image where God really uses the Babylonians to invade the Israelites.
Precisely.
But he tells the Babylonians not to be too comfortable, because he's going to come for them too.
Correct.
It's an interesting.
Correct.
And the individual role of the Christian in political behavior is, you've put it well.
Yeah.
And let's move to now the corporate,
Yes.
the corporate aspect,
The structures.
and some of the what you can say brood perspectives. They are so settled.
Yeah.
But we need to engage them. For
Correct.
instance, there's an obsession with having Christian leaders. Now we're going to the elections, and one of the things that even some have said, we want a Christian nation, we want a kingdom nation. And so, because they are going to save us from, the indignities that we find. Now, your perspective.
My perspective is that we do not necessarily need a Christian leader or a Christian politician to achieve God's purposes.
No, that does not sit very well with a lot of
Correct. But God,
evangelism-oriented
yes,
Christians. Yes.
we must know that God can use anyone. And he has done that before. He can use anyone to achieve his purposes. But he still calls those people, and that's why he says, the sheep and the goats will raise together. The wheat and the tares will grow together. I will sort them out in the last day. But let me come back to what then does it mean for us. I believe that what God is calling us as Christians in this society and in this particular political is to live in his identity. What does it mean to live in his identity? That he's calling us to be his representatives in whichever space we find ourselves in. And that our influence is not only when we are in positions of influence, but rather it's in every other space that we find ourselves in. Now, whether or not we have one of us, and we have had situations where we have people who are born again and Bible-believing Christians in positions of power,
including some presidents around the continent.
Around the continent. But you see, there are two things that sometimes have not been separated. That whereas there is the individual position and values and convictions, unless those individual values and convictions are transferred to the systems that are being run, the person then remains very fragile and corruptible.
So there is a certain I think there's a movie called Lost in Translation.
Precisely.
There's individual passionate
Precisely.
evangelistic everything, but is unable to translate.
Precisely. The point I'm trying to say is that, and the transformation of the system and the structure is first, of course, a leadership question, but it takes more than the leader. And therefore, the thinking, the thinking of this one leader who will come and save us, the messianic kind of thinking, this one Messiah who will come and lead us, is what we see being a big trouble even for the children of Israel. They told God, no, we don't want to be worshiping you who we don't see. We want one of our own, who we can always go and take our it's an idolization, if I may. The point I'm trying to say is that we need to be able to see that all of us contribute to building structures that are functional or dysfunctional. And that the leader of us is only as good as one of us and the structures that we have. Because, for instance, we can elect Furi, or maybe you said you don't want, you can elect me, into an office. But if everybody else continues to bribe their way, to steal money for drugs, and to the system becomes impossible to build, because the system cannot be equal, the structure cannot be equal to the leader. Let's use an example in the Bible, perhaps to illustrate this. Now, when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem and starts his ministry, he's working in a politically volatile, oppressive, and dictatorial system of government. The children of Israel and the Jews in particular have been under oppression, including by the Gentiles, under the Roman Empire, the larger Roman Empire. And therefore, when they hear of Jesus, they hear of the Messiah, of the King who has come to redeem them. And it's interesting that even the disciples that he walks around with are convinced that he actually has come to establish his kingdom. Now, he interacts with one structure, the tax system.
Yeah.
The tax system is one system that was the most representative of an oppressive regime. Because the person people interacted with very commonly, apart from the Roman soldiers and the jailers who put you into prison for different crimes, was the taxman, tax collectors. And if there is places where we see Jesus coming under sharp criticism, is every time he has had an interaction with a tax collector.
And he gave very personalized attention
to them.
Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus, for instance. So Zacchaeus hears Jesus is coming to his town. Now, he must have been a powerful guy. He must have been the guy, he was a tax collector, so he was in charge. Those days, the individual tax collectors, because of the structure and, the very system, very personalized systems of those days, the tax collector was basically this, the institution, was the organization. Because they collected this money, of course, they even set the rates and collected even sometimes more than what they're supposed to collect. And when Zacchaeus meets with Jesus, he climbs on a tree, then Jesus tells him, no, I know you are used to power, but if you are to engage with me, you must come down. Come down, and we are going to your house. He goes through a transformation at a very personal level, where he sees his sins, he sees his brokenness, he sees the injustice of the system for what it is. And Zacchaeus does three things. First, he turns his heart. What we have been talking about, the personal salvation. But his personal salvation has very direct public implications. Because he says, I have been overseeing a corrupt system. I've been running a bad structure of taxation. So this is what I'm going to do. First, for everybody that I have on record as having defrauded, I'm going to return to them 4 times what I took. Oh, how I wish KRA will do that. But I'm going to return to each of them 4 times. But because there are many who have been affected by my decisions, there are many who have been impoverished by the kind of system I have done. And maybe allow me just to digress and come back to Kenya. There are many families that have been pushed into poverty because of the sickness of one of their own, because of the education of one of their own, because of a family land loss. And they have had to spend all their money treating that one, or taking that one child to school, or trying to fight that dispute for their land in court. Zacchaeus says, I will give half of my wealth to undertake a corrective process. So you may be asking, what exactly should Christians be doing? That's the question you asked me. What is our evangelistic role in this political system? 3 things. We have the proclamative role of saying that this is not all there is. and calling people to see their sins for what they are. But we also have a prophetic role to speak of the systems as if they were. Not to be part of the narrative that this country is gone to the dogs. Not to be part of the narrative that things are so bad they will never change. The businesses in this country, unless you are corrupt, you can never run a clean business. You can never run clean campaigns. And that even believers are busy trying to find money, not to run campaigns, but to bribe voters. Because everybody else is going to be doing that. But the biggest role we have is a restorative.
When you talk about the restorative role
Yes.
of the church,
Yeah.
Because we're talking about a church right now, as we look at it,
That requires restoration.
is unable to say no to a visiting politician and in a congregation, for instance. I mean, the priest, the leaders of the church are unable to, in a way, speak to this system that has come right into their space.
Yeah.
And even something that is also very saddening is that when this political person stands in a congregation and starts speaking ill of another person, the congregation, who is supposed to have this political behavior, actually clap as this person from the political system is actually speaking ill against what you can call the neighbor.
Yeah.
Where do we even, how does such a church even, move into 2022 and look like it's going to be helpful?
First, I think we need to appreciate that the entry or the dominance of the enterprise church has done more damage than good. What is an enterprise church? The enterprise church is a church and an institution whose bottom line is no longer saving souls, but it's amassing power and wealth. It is interesting how we compare. You have this whole list of the richest pastors, and in Kenya, in Nigeria is a bit more common to do that. But it's interesting that we compare politicians by what they have, and in the same breath, we also compare pastors by what they have. In other words, the world. So what has that done? What that has done is that because the bottom line is amassing wealth so that then you be like them, and beat them in their own game, the identity gets corrupted. And when the identity gets corrupted, then it no longer matters how you get to that end. You basically assist God to get there. And therefore, whatever comes, instead of Zacchaeus being told by Jesus, come down, it's Zacchaeus who tells Jesus, panda mti, come up. And so Jesus, can you imagine? But because Jesus knows his identity is established, he knows Zacchaeus needs him more than he needs Zacchaeus. He definitely does need Zacchaeus. But Zacchaeus has a need in his heart. And so is this politician, is this wealthy woman who comes to church. He needs that to be proclaimed, to be prophesied over, to be restored more than the church needs the money. But when the identity is corrupted, then it turns the other way around. And it becomes that now the congregation needs this man more than this man needs Jesus.
What a reversal.
So it becomes a reversal. It becomes completely. But it's because the spirit of extraction. Once it becomes, you see, the only
extraction rhymes with kill, steal,
precisely.
And destroy.
It's sad. But you see, there are only two softwares that we see in the Bible running from Genesis to Revelation. One is a spirit of contentment, which comes with an appreciation that I am a limited mortal being in need of a savior, and what he has given me is enough, and I'm able to say, thank you, Lord, in this circumstance. But there is a spirit of greed. the extractive spirit that sees Cain kill his brother Abel.
The first death in the Bible
Oh,
is
yeah.
by murder, right?
By murder. It's greed. That sees Adam and Eve eat the fruit that they had been told not to eat. They are greedy for power.
Want to be like God.
Want to be like God. And you see it running. Paul comes and says, contentment with godliness is great gain. But those that desire, those that want to get wealthy and rich, sometimes pierce themselves with many pierces, as it were. And therefore, what has happened is that when we have a warped identity, we stop seeing the brokenness of the world, we stop seeing the brokenness of people, and people here including the politicians and the presidents of this world and whoever they are, and instead we see them for what they have, and we desire that. And therefore that's why it becomes very difficult. But there's an interesting twist to this, my brother. I've had opportunity to talk to a number of politicians. And you will be surprised. One showed me, see all these cards? These are pastors. They didn't come to pray for me. They came to ask from me. And one said, I wish they had just asked me, what are my needs? I needed prayer. One of them is a brother in the Lord. And he said, my biggest headache is my fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord.
Because they are in extracting.
They are,
greedy.
because they are coming to extract from me. They think I have. So I asked them, if I give each of you even a certain portion of money, you do the math and tell me how much I'm supposed to be earning every month. So it's a spirit. Once a spirit starts becoming, and that's a spirit I worry that has started dominating our public space. Not that has started, is dominating our public space. And instead of us as a church bringing a different narrative, a different perspective,
a different power,
an alternative power, because we are coming from a source of an identity that is assured, we have sacrificed our identity, and therefore we are saying, I want to be like them.
You know, when you are at that, because it's important for us as we come to the end of this conversation for us to hear, because 2022 is coming.
It's here. It's here.
It's here. The election year is with us.
Yeah.
And would want, now, the church as it is, from what you've said, has an identity corruption.
Yeah.
Not even crisis. An identity corruption. And we still are hopeful that the church can bring the country to a turnaround, the systems, to a place where they turn around to serve and to produce dignity for the citizens. Now, give us very specific things that the church must do for her to be effective and be influential in terms of the outcomes and the processes of this election year.
Good. I think, first of all, there is a great need to acknowledge the corruptness that has happened. That we are barely holding a mirror image, unfortunately a very warped mirror image of what we ought to be. And acknowledging that means saying, indeed I am a sinner. Indeed we are part of the problem. And you see Ezra doing that. Ezra prays and says, God, we have sinned. Nehemiah does that. Because you cannot start the process of restoration before you have come to an acknowledgement of what needs to be restored. You can't be in the pit and trying to fix the pit.
You can be corrupt.
So,
precisely.
And therefore, I believe that a big part of it is saying we have allowed ourselves to be corrupted. And for that, we are wrong. And that has to happen at a corporate level, but it also has to happen at an individual level. Because you see a lot of competition. I mean, you see a lot of running down of institutions, and you're told there are Christians in this institution, but the way it is running, you cannot connect the dots.
So, an acknowledgement.
An acknowledgement. But secondly, I think we must start engaging, because we cannot not engage. We must start engaging on the kind of values, the kind of convictions we want to see within the leaders that we elect, by leaving them in the spaces that we find ourselves in, by demonstrating. And there are institutions. You know, interestingly, there are a lot of the institutions we celebrate in this country to date were founded by churches, were founded on a godly foundation. Whether you think about high schools, you think about hospitals, you think about institutions of differently abled persons, and across the country, they were
even some agricultural practices.
Precisely, they were established on a very biblical and godly foundation. And therefore, we still have the space to come and say, this is how it can be done better. This is how finances can be collected and used for the collective good. This is how we can treat the poor. You know, it is worrying that sometimes some of the institutions we have built, even as churches, even church members cannot go there because they cannot afford. Because again, they are built based on the concept of enterprise. It's a bottom line that matters, you know. And therefore, if you cannot afford, please, you know, up your faith or up your wallet. Make a choice. So I think the demonstrating of the values and the convictions that we want to live, we cannot, I cannot talk about integrity and desire integrity if in the organization that I lead, there is no integrity that can be traced in me.
So it's critical that we actually embody
Precisely.
and bring alive the values
Precisely.
and the kingdom vision in our local circumstances.
In our local circumstances. The reason why I'm saying that is that election 2022 is not the end. It is part of a continuum. If you have steal, kill, and destroy on one end, extreme end, and you have abundant life on the other end of the continuum, elections are somewhere fall in here. And any leader that we choose either helps us move towards abundance and restoration, or towards death and destruction.
But they all promise as abundance.
Precisely.
But in reality.
But you see,
question, yes.
We can demonstrate. Because I don't want us to be completely consumed with 2022 elections as though they were. The mess we are in, Furi, let's agree, cannot be corrected within 1 year to elections. I am speaking of a long-term process.
And that is that identity consciousness.
Identity consciousness, identity choice, because we must make a choice. Which side we want to be associated with. The side of abundance and restoration, fullness of life, or the side of killing and destroying the dignity of God's people.
Okay. One more practical thing.
I think we must identify actively and support the people we think espouse the kind of values and convictions. Now, this has to happen not only at a corporate level, but also at an individual level. For instance, we know very well whether even without bribing or gaming any of the election processes, campaigns require money. How many of us as believers actually do contribute to the cause we believe in? Our time, our money, our talents. But we want to sit back and then get everybody selected. And then basically what we come and do is basically then you have two options. Both are dark, and you choose the one that is darker to your side, or the one that resembles you more closely, which is either ethnic or religious or family or clan or whatever form that we pick. We cannot sit back and wait for the day of voting. We must be involved from the primaries. That's a very practical. Let's not say it's for goons. It becomes for goons when good people, Must have been Martin Luther who said, evil prospers when good people do nothing. So by just sitting back and sitting relaxed and saying, I'm not going to be involved. In my day-to-day job, I'm involved with matters of public finance. And I know very well that our Constitution provides for a framework of participation. But many people, even those who can, do not participate. And then we are all complaining about how things are not being done. So we cannot not engage. But I must emphasize, Furi, there is no way we will change this country in the long run unless we take up the call of God, the evangelistic call of God, to go out there and proclaim his goodness, prophesy to the systems, and work to restore them. It's a Jeremiah call. Jeremiah 1:10 says, for have I not appointed you to go and uproot, tear down, pull down, and destroy, and then plant and build.
Plant and build. Dr. Rugo, plant and build.
Build is our call.
I like the fact that passage ends with planting and building.
Yeah.
And as we look into this year, into this political season, it's about planting and building.
Correct.
And you have told us very strongly that we must, of course, repent. We must also individualize the responsibility and also participate actively in supporting leaders who we see as
the embodiment of the values.
Looking at the value, having the values that would lead us towards abundance. I mean, this is a great conversation.
Thank you.
With wonderful insights, and we really appreciate. And may God help you also, even as you continue to do your active role.
Thank you very much.
And continually do it as well as you are already doing.
Thank you.
So God bless you. We appreciate. And I love the insight about Zacchaeus. I mean, Jesus told Zacchaeus, come down. But sometimes we deal with situations whereby some influential people in politics tell the church, come up, I can lift you up. Now, let's remember, friends, as we engage the political sphere and political dynamics, that we have the power. We take the position of telling Zacchaeus, come down. Thank you very much for being part of this session, and thank you for being part of the Evangelism Summit, and continue engaging and continue participating in all the programs that this summit is presenting. Definitely life-changing. Again, thank you for being part of this session. God bless you.